and further said that the two women, prisoners at the bar, were then on board the said sloop and wore men's jackets and long trousers and handkerchiefs tied about their heads, and that each of them had a machete and pistol in their hands, and cursed and swore at the men to murder the deponent. So reads a description of Anne Bonny and Mary Read. It is a vision quite colourful and picturesque, and what's so amazing is that it was told by an eyewitness, so we can be almost certain that this is what the women pirates actually looked like. The pistol is of course a weapon, intimately connected to our vision of the pirate. From the pell-mell chaos of boarding combat, to intense standoffs between hot-headed rivals, a beachfront duel at dawn, or even concealed at a game of cards. Where there's a pirate, there's a pistol. And today, we'll be learning all about them. The first handheld firearms were crude boomsticks needing one hand to hold it, and a second to hold the ignition method, usually a burning match. These were procedurally supplanted by locks, which incorporated the ignition into the gun itself, allowing the gun to be held with both hands. But it's unknown who first developed the idea for something like a pistol. Certain handguns were short enough to be regarded as a pistol, but they still needed a second hand to be used reliably. Long arms are generally excellent for any purpose, but there was a definite interest among cavalrymen, close quarters combatants and assassins for a gun which could be used effectively with a single hand. Early experiments included the Buse, a very short firearm discharged at close range by pulling a steel rasp against a piece of pyrite. Though the Buse had a hook for carrying it on a belt, and was small enough to conceal and suitable only at close range, it still required both hands to use. In Japan at least, matchlock pistols were seemingly popular enough, but I am not sure about their efficacy or popularity. It wasn't until the invention of the wheellock that the first true pistol could appear, sometime in the third decade of the 16th century. It allowed the gun to be kept ready and loaded, and taken out and fired with a single hand. As for the word pistol, it came into use in the 1540s, but wouldn't become widespread until later. Rival terms included saddle harquebuses, tacks, or dags. The origin of the term pistol has been disputed. One idea claims it stems from the Czech piszczela, meaning pipe or whistle, and pipe was a common term for guns across all Europe. The Czech were some of the earliest adopters of effective firearms. The rival contender for the origin of the term is the Italian pistolese, meaning something from the town of Pistoia. It originally referred to a small dagger, its tactical use and carriage reminiscent of a pistol, and 16th century Italy was especially prominent as a firearms and gun lock manufacturer. So it isn't hard to believe that the original pistols came from Pistoia and were thus called pistols. The earliest wheellock pistols were large things, designed for cavalrymen to be carried in holsters at the saddle bow. Cavalry pistols can be distinguished by the almost horizontal bend of their grip, but they were also used by infantry. Eric XIV of Sweden, the Schizo King, illustrated soldiers from his army, including shield-bearing grenadiers. They carried a round metal shield in one hand and a pistol in the other. This allowed them to break through a line of pikes and clear an opening through the formation itself. And pikemen often struggled to defend themselves in close quarters, but some caught up to the grenadiers and carried pistols of their own. Some shields were even designed with built-in pistols. Aboard the wreck of the Mary Rose were found wooden shields covered with iron plates and a small central hole, allowing for the insertion of a small, breech-loading matchlock handgun. Their finding aboard the Mary Rose implies at least some maritime usage. As for usage among pirates, the 16th century pistol seems largely to have been kit of the elites. Martin Frobisher, commander of the Elizabethan Sea Dogs, was painted with a wheellock pistol in hand. But Frobisher was far, very far, from a common Jack tar. A rival to the complicated wheellock soon appeared, in the form of the snaphorns. It is essentially a more convoluted proto-flintlock. The snaphorn's pistol appears on this 1594 painting of Army Captain Thomas Lee, dressed in Irish attire. The pistols of the 16th century can be most distinguished by the nowadays peculiar looking shape of their handles. They were quite jagged, but in the 17th century, the corners would get rounded off into a shape more comfortably held. Between the early 17th century and the late 18th, the curved but firmly L-shaped pistol grip we're familiar with would slowly develop. But the general shape of a flintlock pistol would remain largely the same between 1650 and 1800. Pistol shapes and handles varied immensely, but came in three basic variants. The straighter, more horizontal cavalry grip, the more L-shaped, more angled belt pistol, and then pistols which would fall somewhere in between. The most important innovation in the history of pistols was, however, the French lock, or true flintlock. Combining the knowledge of previous locks, it was the simplest but also most reliable of the flint gun designs. Most importantly, it was cheaper to produce than wheel and snap locks, which meant that reliable pistols could now be made more widely available to the unwashed masses. Caribbean colonists were early adopters both of the flintlock musket and pistol. Of colonists on Martinique in the 1630s, the following was reported. They never went to work unless they were armed, each having his flintlock musket and 2 pistols at his belt, with its cartridge box. The musket would typically be rested against a tree, so the pistol was their most accessible means of defense against a sudden Carib ambush. We can presume that a lot of early Buccaneers were equipped in a similar fashion. In the late 1640s, Thomas Gage mentioned pistols, both as a common weapon of pirates and of Spanish colonists. He even mentioned them as being possessed by Chilean natives. The long and curved handle of the flintlock pistol might look barbaric to our eyes today, but speaking both as an experienced gunman, albeit with limited pistol experience, and an owner of 2 flintlock pistols, the curved handle fits very snugly and comfortably into your hand. However, I do have to say that the belt pistol is more comfortable than the horse pistol, at least when not riding a horse. Perhaps it is different then, so I can definitely see why the quote-unquote modern pistol grip was developed. Notably, they have very prominent, rounded butts. These serve 2 purposes. One is as a counterbalance to the barrel, essentially serving as a seesaw, lifting the gun upwards and keeping it upright upon your target. Otherwise, the weight of the barrel tends to pull your aim downwards. It is also a comfortable handrest. Secondly, it allowed the pistol to be used as a club. After firing the pistol, it could be flipped around, gripped by the barrel, and swung. The butts were usually studded with metal for this purpose. The butts could come in the form of balls, pear shapes, but some pistols terminated in a flat flare, which would have been a good handrest, but less suitable as a club. In the 17th century especially, the era of Baroque art, pistols were often garishly decorated. The woodwork could be lined with metal curlicues, the lockplate could be engraved, but were most often marked with the gunmaker's signature. French navy pistols would be marked with the gunsmith's name and a pair of crossed anchors. And very common was to have the butt fashioned with a grotesque, a demonic-looking face. This can best be observed in an actual pirate pistol, found in the wreck of the Widow Galley, and possibly owned by Sam Bellamy himself. The other side of the lockplate is secured to the stock with flowery, serpentine shapes. The escutcheon or trigger guard is decorated with a devil mask, very fitting for a pirate. Most impressive might be the gargoyle on the butt cap. It could be a solar deity commemorating Louis XIV, the Sun King of France. Others have suggested a Scottish manufacture, and that the grotesque might commemorate William III. These fanciful pistols would, however, have been reserved for those who could afford them at a very steep price. One can only imagine how it ended up on a pirate ship. Pistols were short-range weapons, very short range. You'd usually just fire it right into someone's face, or literally stick it into their belly. They were not designed for precision, so like most period arms, the barrel was smoothbore. This gave the projectile less range and accuracy than rifled arms, but again, wasn't really a problem. Neither was it really necessary to provide a pistol with sights, because you weren't really supposed to carefully aim them. Some pistols did at least come with front sights, and these became standard on cavalry pistols in the 1730s. And of course there were pistols with both rifling front and rear sights, but these were only really possessed by the nobility, and might not be as frequently used as the rugged arms of a pirate. It is impossible to classify period pistols into any comprehensive categories, but they essentially appeared in three basic sizes: big, medium, and small. And popular theorizing would say that horse pistols were the biggest and infantry pistols medium to small, but such wasn't always the case. For example, I possess a horse pistol smaller than a navy pistol. Neither did these classifications truly define where the pistols were to be found. Horse pistols could still be found aboard of ships. And this can be observed aboard a wreck of the Elizabeth and Mary, where pistols of both medium horse, large belt, and a small pistol was found. And popularity of pistol size also differed between nations. The French and English seem to have favored small to medium pistols, whereas Dutch sailors really loved large ones. It mustn't be underestimated how much early modern firearms and especially pistols varied. The amount of different puffers present in the POTC franchise serves as an excellent testament to this. Though I will have a dedicated section talking about specific pistols later on, the popularity of the turn-off pistol during the golden age of piracy really warrants a discussion here. First appearing in the 1640s, and being especially common in England, the barrel of this pistol was designed to unscrew just in front of the chamber, allowing it to be loaded directly from the back. It is like they say, when the back is prominent, it is best to do it from behind. Wait, what? The turn-off was locked and unlocked with a small key, allowing it to be unscrewed or turned off. A wrench was added to assist with the loading, engaged against a lug on the barrel. Contrary to common belief, this wasn't made to allow for speedier loading. Pistols were short enough to reload quickly anyway, and you wouldn't have time to reload a pistol in combat. You'd fire and go into melee. Instead, the turn-off design made the bullet fit more tightly into the bore than on a muzzleloader, reducing the escape of gases and increasing both power and accuracy. This also made rifling more practical, so a lot of 17th century turn-off pistols have rifled barrels. Of course, the turn-off barrel also made a pistol easier to clean. By the early 18th century and the reign of Queen Anne, the popularity of the pistol would give it the name Queen Anne pistol. Anne ruled during the so-called Queen Anne's War, where privateering was especially prominent. She was a great sponsor of them, and appears to have been loved among the later pirates. So it is befitting to see Blackbeard depicted with an entire armory of them. He even named his flagship Queen Anne's Revenge. Though the turn-off was initially popular among cavalrymen, by the end of the 17th century they had been entirely relegated to belt and pocket pistols. One of the distinguishing features of the turn-off was the omitting of the forestock. This made a pistol easier to tuck and draw, and to conceal in a pocket, a muff, or even the cock of a hat. Scotsman Donald MacBain documented the following in the early 18th century. At last he pulled up his hand and took a pistol from the cock of his hat. He cocked it against his shoulder and presented it to me, upon which I asked quarters, but he refused, and calling me an English booger, and fired at me and ran for it. One of the balls went through my cravat. Indeed, pocket pistols were a favorite tool of assassins, scoundrels, and cheaters at the card table. The troubles caused by these pistols necessitated their outlawing in several places. In New York in 1684, pocket pistols and other concealed weapons were banned. Literally 1684. Whether big or small or somewhere in between, size didn't matter. All pistols had their lover, and they all had the same purpose. Pull it out of your pants, tug the cock, spray and pray. In tactical use of the pistol can be divided into 7 stages: loading, carrying, drawing, aiming, firing, clubbing, and maintenance. So let's go through all of them. Loading a flintlock pistol was pretty straightforward. And pull the cock back to half cock, and prime the pan, ram powder, wad, and bullet down the barrel with the ramrod, and the gun is loaded. Turn-offs, as aforementioned, were loaded by unlocking the barrel, screwing it off, inserting the mother load into the breech, screwing the barrel back on, and priming the pan. Pistols, being much smaller than muskets and carbines, were loaded with a much smaller powder charge. It is hard to estimate period powder charges because it was based both on the size of the bullet and quality of powder. So recommendations differed very much, not to mention the many different sizes of pistols. But generally, a pistol had about a quarter or a fifth of the stopping power of a musket. One could get very creative with the ammunition, since any projectile can be stuffed on a muzzleloader, provided it won't damage the bore too much. It was basically the norm to have multiple projectiles. A bullet and smaller pellets, multiple bullets, or improvised ammunition. Slugs were rectangular metal bars. Very common was to use small iron nails. That probably hurt a lot. You could even crush up a pipe and load a clay. After loading the pistol, you wanted to put it somewhere on your person. This depended on accessibility and the size of the pistol, and carriage methods were virtually endless and also a very contested topic in the pirate community. It will in fact warrant its own prolonged section later on. But it appears as if it was most common to simply keep the pistol in a pocket or tuck it into a belt or sash. Belt pistols usually had a hook opposite the lock plate, allowing them to be secured to a belt. Contrary to popular belief, the hook was usually kept on the outside and the lock tucked against the body. While this can hurt over time, it both kept the pistol more secure and safeguarded the priming powder. Pistols were typically sold in pairs, and most common for boarders was to keep a pair of pistols on them, usually called a brace of pistols. You also had to decide whether you wanted to keep the pistol at half or full cock. A half cock is the safety position. In order to fire the pistol, the cock needs to be pulled to full cock. Thus, the answer might seem obvious, but it isn't. Flintlock cocks are large, heavy, and the mechanic cumbersome, so it is difficult and often impossible to cock it with only your thumb, as presented in a few movies. Without a hand steadying the pistol while cocking it, it will usually result in the pistol just being tipped upwards. And cocking a gun was also loud, and could ruin a potential surprise attack. So it might be preferable to cock the pistol beforehand and keep it ready to fire at a moment's notice. But this at the risk of accidental discharge, in case you get too excited. Wait, what? The trigger pull on the flintlocks tend to be quite soft, so any inconvenient tremor could set a cocked pistol off. And keeping pistols cocked seemed to have been quite common among pirates, as recorded in one rather comical incident written by William Snelgrave, a pirate prisoner, where upon lifting up his broadsword, he swore no quarter should be given to any captain that offered to defend his ship, aiming at the same time a full stroke at my head. To avoid it I stooped so low that the quarterdeck rail received a blow. By good fortune his pistols, that hung at his girdle, were all discharged, otherwise he would doubtless have shot me. Then again, some pistols had faulty locks, which might discharge anyway at half-cock. Some flintlocks, like miquelets and snap-haunces, have less reliable half-cocks than French or dog locks, more prone to wearing down and becoming useless. The cock could be pulled in a multitude of ways. Most suitable was to hold the pistol in one hand and cock it with the other. But most boarders had a sword in one hand and a pistol in the offhand. In this case, the pistol could be cocked against your other hand, the sword grip, your shoulder, or any other piece of equipment. As Donald McBain previously noted, even a pocket pistol had to be cocked against a shoulder, instead of using only a thumb. With the pistol cocked, it can be aimed. Most common was just to hold the pistol in the regular fashion, usually one-handed. Two hands is mostly for recoil control, which isn't a huge problem with non-repeating pistols. Neither are flintlock pistols especially heavy, and can be aimed with a single hand without much trembling, and you mostly had a sword in your other hand anyway. If you wanted to aim, you could sight along the barrel and try to align it. The pistol could also be aimed sideways, gangster style, allowing you to use gaps in the lock as a sighting mechanism. Sideways aiming was common among cavalry, since it protected the priming powder. Here we need to discuss range. Pistols were fired at very close distances. On horseback, manuals recommended that pistols were fired within 2 or 3 yards, roughly the same in meters, close enough to cinch the doublet. Indeed, flaming residue or the muzzle flash was often prone to setting pieces of clothing on fire. A pirate negotiator, John Clayton, was shot from behind by a pistol loaded with 3 bullets, at such close a range that the wadding set his shirt on fire. Pirates often fired their pistols even closer than so. Jean-Baptiste Labat, when boarded by Spanish corsairs, documented the following. This noise made the Spaniards, who were on deck, suppose that we were preparing to defend the cabin, and they promptly charged through the door. One of them pressed the muzzle of his pistol against my body and pulled the trigger. But fortunately for me, the priming flashed in the pan, and did not fire the charge. Indeed, misfires for flintlock pistols were incredibly common. They appear in so many accounts of boarding combat. The most astonishing account comes from the story of Philip Ashton, of a pistol misfiring 4 times in a row, which would be comical if his story wasn't so tragic. This did not pacify the quartermaster, who with outrageous cursing and swearing clapped his pistol to my head and snapped it, but it missed fire. This enraged him the more, and he repeated the snapping of his pistol at my head 3 times, and it as often missed fire, upon which he held it overboard and snapped it a 4th time, and then it went off very readily. Okay, that is kinda funny. Misfires could happen for a multitude of reasons. The flint might be improperly seated, the lock damaged, improper wadding, the priming powder wet, of poor quality, in low amount, or it might have slipped out of the pan, or the flint strike just failed to ignite it. But yes, this was the drawback of the flintlock and its cheapness. The unreliability of the pistol often allowed victims to avoid pistol shots even at close range. If a pistol was pressed into your body, you could sidestep, or slam it aside with your hand or sword. Aside from the failure of the human factor, there's a slight lag between brain reaction, trigger pull, and the hammer striking the lock, allowing for the success of such maneuvers. This even allowed for a quick sleight of hand to interrupt the lock itself. In 1643, when Martin Adriansen attempted to assassinate Willem Kieft of New Amsterdam, one of the councillors thrust his thumb between the cock and frizzen of the murderer's pistol. That must have hurt. Gunflints are small, but sharp, and flints cut deep. Even if the pistol successfully discharged, it wasn't guaranteed to murder or even hit. Remember McBain's mention of the Frenchman's bullet going through his cravat but missing any flesh. In another incident, McBain described a pistol ball passing through his hat and hair, but missing the head itself. These weapons were not hallmarks of marksmanship, and indeed, even modern pistols aren't especially accurate. You can only accomplish so much without a shoulder stock. The benefit of modern pistols is that they have multiple shots. With a flintlock, you only had 1. But of course, the biggest fault always lies in the shooter. It is difficult to be accurate during the stress of a combat situation. Pistols may not have been an instant "I win" button, but they were a reliable weapon. The accounts of pirate victims surviving due to a misfire could be seen as survivor bias. Think of all the accounts that went unpublished due to pistols working. And even if it misfired, didn't hit, didn't kill, or if you had more targets to fight, it was best to grab the barrel and use the hard end as a club. In the late 18th and early 19th century, American sailors would even throw their discharged pistols like a tomahawk, but pirates would never have done this. American sailors used pistols owned by the ship itself, whereas pirate pistols were, well, private property of the pirates. That's a tongue twister for you. As a side note, pistols owned by the ship were usually marked as such, with the ship's name. Some even had a marking indicating to what part of the ship they belonged. QD for quarterdeck, GD for gun deck, or F for forecastle. Anyway, throwing the pistol would risk damaging or losing it, which pirates wanted to avoid. Reloading pistols in combat was only really done by cavalry. In certain formations, they would pull up to the enemy, fire their pistols, retreat, reload, and repeat. In boarding combat, this would be impossible. You had men in front of you, men behind you, nowhere to run. It was fire and wade into melee. So the next step after clubbing is maintenance. Pirates took great care of their firearms. Their shipboard laws usually had rules demanding constant maintenance, as excellent performance in battle was paramount. Maintenance was the same as any flintlock, as I've discussed in previous videos. The lock removed, the frizzen heated until soft, hardened and flattened with a piece of logwood, the touch hole cleaned with a pick, the innards greased, hot water poured in and out of the barrel to clean out powder residue, the flint chipped into an appropriate shape, or replaced. Pistols were not always carried on your person. When not in immediate use, it was best to keep them protected. They'd be greased up, the muzzle plugged, and kept in a dedicated case. Pistols were usually sold in pairs, braces, and came together in a case, containing both the pistols and the tools to maintain them. Inside of a cabin, pistols might be hanged on a hook next to a bed, as Captain Taylor had them. And then, of course, we can return once more to the multitude of carrying methods on an individual person. According to most written descriptions and eyewitness illustrations, the most common carriage method for infantry was to keep the pistol in a pocket, if it was small enough or the pocket big enough, or tuck it into a belt. Most often, you'd keep the pistol in your offhand and a sword in your main hand. So if you're right-handed, you'd want a pistol on your right side, allowing you for an easy pull with your left hand. This mode of carrying is best shown on this eyewitness illustration of a filibuster. I never shut up about it, it is so good, one of the few eyewitness depictions we have of a pirate. As you can see, he has his right hand cutlass on his left side, a large horse pistol, I noticed by the handle, tucked into his belt, lock against his body, and a much smaller pistol, possibly a turn-off, in the pocket of his waistcoat. The debate comes in regards to carrying methods possibly unique to pirates: holsters and silk slings. Both of these ideas stem from the very controversial book, A General History of the Pirates, which had a tendency of inventing stuff about pirates to spice up the story and make it more interesting. According to this book, Blackbeard kept his pistols in the following fashion. He wore a sling over his shoulders with 3 brace of pistols, hanging in holsters like bandoliers. A General History has also been supplied with a number of illustrations, all of which provide different interpretations of Blackbeard's holsters and pistols. In the first edition, Blackbeard wears a large sling cast across his chest, with large holsters stuck to it, and the pistols loosely tucked inside of it. In an edition from, I think, 1725 or 6, he wears a double sling, each with these simple leather rings attached to it, and small pistols, probably turn-offs, tucked inside. On this illustration, Blackbeard has several cavalry holsters or buckets attached to his sling. 1 brace of pistols are seemingly kept in the same style of holsters, but upon his hip, kinda like a cowpoke. The problem with these illustrations and Johnson's written description is that they do not agree with any other source, written, illustrated, or archaeological. It seems to be based upon the newspaper article from 1717, claiming that every man in Blackbeard's crew had enough arms to fire 5 times before reloading, but there are no specific descriptions of holsters or what guns they had specifically, so it was most likely Johnson spicing things up. The sort of leather ring holsters were most often used for holding a sword or a boarding axe. Certainly, they could technically be enlarged and used for holding a pistol, but I've never heard of it being done. The closest I've seen would be ring holsters used as saddle equipment for carbines. These would not be especially difficult or expensive to make, but for an infantryman, it doesn't seem as if they were more effective than just tucking the pistol into a belt. Interestingly, I've seen illustrations of Napoleonic-era rocket troops having belt holsters with pistols in them, but nothing like it used by other troops of the period. Napoleonic officers only seem to have tucked pistols into their belt or sash. The second proposition are the large, cowboy-looking holsters, as seen on the later illustration. These were called bucket holsters, and aside from a general history, are only ever depicted or mentioned in the context of cavalry. They were worn on the saddle. It wasn't until the 19th century and advent of the revolver that bucket holsters would become popular belt equipment. But even as far as the American Civil War, you'd have combatants wearing revolvers just tucked into their belt. There is some archaeological evidence for a sort of bucket holster used by pirates. If you remember Sam Bellamy's pistol from the Widder Galley, it was discovered inside of a cover made of hemp, explained as a holster. I have this original picture of it, where it does kind of look like a holster, but after hundreds of years under the sea, it isn't certain if this was the original shape or simply something it assumed. It could simply have been a bag for safekeeping the pistol, but there are some who have sworn by the hemp holster's reliability and authenticity, and feature it in reenactment events. The next point of carriage contention is Johnson's description of pirates wearing pistols in silk slings, what he calls the fashion of the pirates. The description reads as follows. Roberts himself made a gallant figure at the time of the engagement, being dressed in a rich crimson damask waistcoat and breeches, a red feather in his hat, a gold chain round his neck, with a diamond cross hanging to it, a sword in his hand, and 2 pair of pistols hanging at the end of a silk sling, flung over his shoulders. Just like Blackbeard, this colourful vision of Roberts was likewise supplied with woodcut illustrations. In the earliest one, the silk sling is shown as being worn around his neck, like a necklace, and terminates in a cartridge box worn over his belly. The pistols appear lazily just tucked into the sling. It could be speculated that the pistols are tucked using hooks, or maybe that they are like pockets inside of the sling. I will just chalk it up to a lazy artist with next to no understanding of pirate equipment. This cheap knockoff of the previous woodcut depicts Roberts in a similar fashion, but now the pistols have been abandoned entirely. In this depiction, similar to the one of Henry Morgan and the one of Blackbeard, the sling is slung across Roberts' chest, and the pistols appear in a cluster tucked into it at his hip. Now, none of these illustrations appear especially believable. Neither does it seem practical or comfortable. Of course, the primary reason for Roberts wearing his pistol in this fashion appears to have been to show off. And indeed, the pirates of this period were very often show-offs, with more bark than bite. However, just like the holster, the silk sling does have some archaeological backing. Again, we return to Sam Bellamy's pistol, which was discovered not only inside of the hemp cover, but with a silk sling tied around the handle. Such an artifact being found halfway across the world from where Bartholomew Roberts was described as wearing one would attest to the silk sling indeed being a universal trend among early 18th century pirates. But it could simply have been a decoration, not intended to be worn around the neck, just flying from the handle like a ribbon. So maybe pirates had a tradition of tying silk ribbons around their pistol handles, Johnson heard of this, and adapted it into something more flashy. Modern artists have taken a liking to it, and have attempted to reproduce Johnson's sling in a more practical fashion. Don Mates, the illustrator behind the rum brand, Captain Morgan, seems to have been the first to draw the silk sling like a thin sort of towel, worn over the neck, with one pistol tied to each end. The pistols would have been heavy enough to cause stress on the neck, and it would have been impossible to take the pistol and fully extend your arm to properly aim it. A more believable version has been made by G. Rava, illustrator for the Osprey book, Pirate, the Golden Age. He shows the sling slung around one shoulder, over the chest, like the third illustration of Roberts, and with the pistol either tucked into it by a belt hook, or the silk sling tied around the trigger guard. Alternatively, the sling could be tied around the handle of the pistol. There are some disputes as to the efficacy of this method. Benson Lill has damned it as uncomfortable. Others claim the silk has slipped off, but I personally find it quite useful. I haven't used actual silk, just a cloth band, but by tying the sling around a handle or trigger guard and tucking the pistol into a belt, it is kept more safely than just tucking it, and it can still be fully extended and aimed. Therefore, if pirates did use silk slings, I think this is how they would have done it. Then again, I think the practical usage of the silk sling, that is, firing the pistol and then letting go of it, but still keeping it on your person, Sounds pretty stupid. You might as well keep the pistol in your hand and club it, to use it as an offhand weapon, or even a shield to parry blows. So, whilst I do have my doubts about pirates using silk slings, I personally like them. They look good and are something unique to pirates to make them stand out. As for artists and writers, do whatever you want, especially the fantasy sort. Go nuts. As for reenactors, do whatever keeps you safe and comfortable, and your pistol secured and well maintained. If that means having a hemp or even a leather holster, go for it. If that means a silk sling around a pistol tucked into a belt, again, do it. There were other carrying methods, somewhat similar to the silk sling. You could drill a hole through the handle of a pistol, stick a lanyard through it, and either keep the lanyard around your neck, secure to a wrist, or a belt. Simple, but really underrated method. A similar sort of technique seems to have been used by Scottish Highlanders. They are usually seen with a pistol dangling from a sort of sling worn around their chest. This illustration from 1790 shows a Scottish mercenary wearing his pistol in a sort of sling, seemingly by a belt hook, in a fashion very similar to the one I described previously. But the sling doesn't appear to be long enough for him to be able to aim and fully extend his arm. Instead, he probably took off the pistol, aimed, fired, and then inserted it back. In 1729, French naval contracts dictated that navy pistols were not to have a belt hook, but a swivel buckle attached to a sling and worn over the shoulder. So similar equipment to what has been described certainly existed in the age of pirates. Interestingly, this method seems derived from cavalry, who'd carry their carbines in a similar manner. But the biggest question might be, how many pistols could you feasibly carry on your person? Blackbeard was famously depicted with 6 pistols, Bart Roberts with 4. According to a 1717 report from the Boston Newsletter, Blackbeard's crew have arms to fire 5 rounds before they load again. It is uncertain if these were all pistols, or a musket and 4 pistols, or even multiple long arms. But there are documented cases of pirates carrying as many as 4 and 3 pistols on their person. In fact, just tucked into their belt alone. How many of them you could carry depended on the size of the person and the size of the pistols. So I certainly think you could carry 6 pistols on your person, 2 or more slung over your chest via slings and buckles or lanyards, 2 to 4 tucked in your belt, and then a pocket pistol in each of your pockets. But maybe don't expect to be especially mobile. It might be better to reserve space for other equipment. Cartridge boxes, sword, boarding axe, grenados. The thing is, would this even be practical? In a melee engagement, you are unlikely to fire more than 1 pistol, and keeping more than 2 seems to have been uncommon. But having multiple pistols on your person certainly made for a fearsome appearance, and piracy was as much about fighting as it was about scaring your opponents, and your rivals close at hand. For this purpose, pirates might just walk around with their pistols directly in their hands, ready to fire at a moment's notice. Pistols were used by pirates for other things than shooting people. You could shoot objects. If they wanted to open a treasure chest, but didn't have a key, they would take a brace of pistols and fire them into the keyhole to force it open. The lock could also be used to light fires. Pistols were a very common gift. Some pirates had laws involving pistols, such as rewarding the finest pair of pistols aboard to whichever man was the first to spot the sails of a prize. According to legend, Henry Morgan sent a pistol, or possibly a musket, as a gift to the governor of Panama. It also served as a threat. Pirates and slave traders would frequently interact with the natives of Madagascar, buying from them provisions and slaves in return for weaponry. To establish friendly relations, it was common to give the Malagasy kings a sample, a taste of what was to come. The captain might send a pair of pistols and receive a bullock in return, which the pirates would butcher, roast, and eat. When Buccaneer Captain Charles Swan arrived in Mindanao, he gifted the Sultan 3 yards of scarlet cloth, 3 yards of broad gold lace, a Turkish scimitar, and a pair of pistols. Of course, a loaded pistol pointed at someone's head was often more effective as a threat than as an actual tool for murder. Pirates pointed loaded pistols as a form of psychological torture to pressure their victims into doing what they wanted, revealing crucial intelligence, handing over treasure, or even signing the articles, thus joining the pirate crew against their will. Of course, aside from shooting their victims, pistols were also used by pirates should they wish to take their own life, usually when threatened with capture. Captain Lothar was found dead by his hunters upon an island, shot, and a pistol burst by his side. A depressing end for one of the last pirates of his age. I wouldn't want to end the video on such a low key, so to wrap up, let's take a look at some interesting variants of the basic flintlock pistol. The Doonlock or Highland pistol was a Scottish flintlock pistol, usually made entirely of metal. Originally brass, but later on steel. It usually had a whale-tail butt and a trigger shaped like a finial or small spherical button, always without a trigger guard. When these pistols came in pairs, one of them usually had a left-hand lock and the other one a right-hand lock. These were the favorite weapons of Highlanders and Jacobites, many of whom did become pirates, in opposition to the ruling monarchy. In the TV series Black Sails, it is seen in the hands of the main protagonist, Captain Flint. The turn-off pistol, as described previously in detail, would in the early to mid-18th century develop into the so-called box lock. The mechanism is held in a box-like feature. From the end of the 18th century, the turn-off system would almost entirely be relegated to pocket pistols. The turn-off system could also be applied to long arms, usually carbines. One of the problems with pre-modern firearms was that they had only one shot and a long reload. Gunsmiths recognized the problem with this and tried to find workarounds pretty much ever since the invention of firearms. While some clever mechanisms for repeating actions were made, most common was simply to add multiple barrels. Double-barreled pistols are a surprisingly common trope in pirate media, going so far back as Treasure Island, where Long John Silver passes a double-barreled pistol to Jim Hawkins. They also appear quite often in the POTC movies, first in the hands of Pintel, and then Captain Sparrow himself. There is at least one document mentioning the pirate possession of double-barreled arms. In a letter from 1702, preserved in the Cape Town archives, a shipwrecked pirate crew of 200 men were described as being all provided with double-barreled guns and pistols, and abundance of ammunition. Double-barreled firearms were very much uncommon in the period, and next to never seen in any practical context, leading some to believe this document to be a mistranslation from Dutch. Still, double-barreled firearms floated around, some could have taken a liking to them, even though they don't seem to have been widely regarded as effective enough to be worth it. Not to be confused with a turn-off pistol, the turn-over pistol consisted of two over and under barrels, mounted upon a swiveling base. Each of the barrels had its own powder pan and frizzen, but the gun had only one lock. After you fired one of the barrels, you turned the next barrel into position. The ramrod was mounted on the side of the two barrels. The system is actually quite old, dating to the 1640s, but would see a sort of renaissance in the early 19th century. But why add one more barrel when you can add 4? The duckfoot pistol was a type of box lock, seemingly rifled on occasion, with 4 barrels. These were designed to fire all at once, and were mounted in a splayed pattern, making it resemble the foot of a duck, hence the name. Though it appeared after the golden age of piracy, it is at least somewhat related to it, and maritime affairs in general. The duckfoot was designed for firing into a crowd, so it would have been useful for someone outnumbered, say a merchant defending a ship against pirates, mutineers, and of course, a slave uprising. Thus, this rather comical weapon does have a darker tone to it. And then it seems we ended on a low key anyway? Well, it's sort of bound to happen when talking about pirates, and it certainly isn't the first nor the last time. I hope you enjoyed this look into Golden Age pirate pistols. If you want to learn more about pirate firearms, I have an entire series on them, which has so far covered an overview, the evolution of the flintlock, and the blunderbuss. At the time of writing, I am not sure if I will make more firearm videos for the time being, since YouTube doesn't seem to like them. If you want to support the channel, I have a merchandise store featuring historically accurate pirate motifs. Otherwise, you can make a one-time donation or become a Patreon supporter. For as little as $1 a month, you get early access to my videos and can watch them without ads and sponsors. Hope you'll enjoy, and I'll see you again soon.